So powerful, this idea that the empty chair represents the patient that's not being treated because you chose to spend the money on somebody that's either in front of you and you do know them, or perhaps even worse, and picking up on Dave Slauson's point, because you've used it and it was known not to be effective, and therefore that was, in a health economic sense, not a good use of limited resources. So I think that was possibly one of the most powerful things.
Very good. And so I agree with you, it's a wicked question, and it's not the best of, it's highlights, isn't it? So I consider every episode look to be a work of art. Each episode to me is like a new album track. You mentioned at the start of series 2 that the second album is always the toughest, and so I think we've got to the end. So thank you to each and every one of our guests. It quite simply doesn't work without you. For me, I'm going to take us back to episode 2 of series 2 and Dr. Karen Sankey. I just listened to it again. Karen describes her work as a GP with the homeless. She describes it as a difficult place to be for a prescriber. So I love that phrase, and that fixing things with chemicals isn't usually the answer or much of a help. Karen then goes on to describe the impact of asking questions of her patients and clients, one of which is, tell me about your backstory and what would a good life look for you? And then she tells us about the story of an amazing, powerful story of a 48-year-old male who cried when she asked him that question, and pointed out that nobody had ever bothered taking the time to ask that question. So that was my first one. Then my second one, was very quickly, Jill Crickshank on episode 4, her desert island drug was nifedipine, and again I've listened back and you can hear the emotion in Jill's voice as she tells us and the listeners her story, and that was the real emotion that we were looking for. I'm not going to tell you any more about Jill's story. If you haven't heard it already, you need to go back and listen to these episodes. Okay, our micro discussion next. I'm going to start by asking Mark for a couple of his, I mentioned earlier, this Brian Goldman, Canadian physician, his do you remember moments. So Brian talks to them on his TED Talk, which you haven't seen it, we'll put it in the show notes, is essential viewing for physicians and clinicians and everybody involved in healthcare. He discusses them in terms of the errors we've made. We don't have to be looking and concentrating on errors. We're looking for memorable medicines moments, Mark, that you can share with our listeners. What comes to mind?
There's a slight problem here, I guess, in the fact I'm still on the GMC register, so I can't go around breaking confidentiality.
We're looking for joyful patient stories without breaking any confidences, obviously.
I mean, on a personal level, so we'll start with something good. So my personal best ever diagnosis was on one of the 7 o'clock ward rounds that we used to do. I arrived on the ward and the night team were in a panic, because there was a patient who was bruised from top to toe, and they said, we don't know what's going on. And this patient was already under 2 colleagues of mine, who were 2 colleagues who I probably respected more than anyone else. This problem had been brewing, but it had suddenly flared up. And I thought, if they don't know the answer, there is no way I will know the answer. So why are you being so horrible to me? They dragged me to this woman's bedside, and it was an old-fashioned ward round where there was a nurse who was standing with us. There was the team standing with us. A couple of medical students had turned up. Obviously, we had one of the pharmacists. It was either Steve or maybe Vicky, who used to work with us. And I looked at this woman and they told me what the history was. And I just laughed because I got it straight away. And they said, well, what's wrong? I said, well, I know the answer. It was a bit unfair on the patient, I guess. But I was just so pleased with myself. They said, well, you're going to tell us what the answer is. I said, oh, right then. I said, she basically just needs a glass of orange juice. And they said, what do you mean she needs a glass of orange juice? I said, she's got scurvy. That was what was wrong with her. She's got scurvy. Now, clearly she didn't need a glass of orange juice because she wasn't absorbing her orange juice. And the next thing was I actually didn't know what the treatment was because I wasn't even sure whether IV vitamin C existed. But anyway, we cobbled something together.
You probably asked me.
Yeah. And we made her better. I remember at the end of the ward round, I was still so pleased that I'd got the answer to this conundrum, that one of the colleagues who she was under, I had his phone number and I phoned him and I said, I got the answer. I said, it was scurvy. It was scurvy. And I was ecstatic, absolutely ecstatic. And I thought, it's a bit unfair, but it's never ever going to be that good again. And it never was that good again. I've seen hundreds of people since then, but I just knew that was the pinnacle of my diagnostic career.
That's why it was so joyful to get up 6 o'clock in the morning and go in for a 7 o'clock ward round. Not just with Mark, with Jay and Anita and all the others. years. One of mine I was going to give, actually, just as an example. This is actually quite a sad case, but we used to get quite a lot of overdoses, obviously, on the medical admissions unit, first thing in the morning. I remember going in one morning, and literally the first person we saw was this lady who had, was obviously, her mental health was poor, and she decided to try to take an overdose. Unfortunately, she had found some quinine tablets. I don't know if you were there actually for this one, Mark. And I can't remember exactly how many she took, but it was less than a packet. It was less than 28. This woman was completely blind. And I was just blown away. I mean, I knew about the theory of chinchinism, but she was completely blind. And I believe she never got full sight back. She did get some sight back. I didn't see her again after maybe 2 days, but that really just showed the toxicity of some of these drugs, that why you don't leave things hanging around in your house, because that is what could happen, and that really stayed with me.
Gimo?
Okay, so weight loss, stomach pain, nausea, those sort of symptoms, and someone who sort of really didn't look well and had been around the houses really. No one had been able to help her. On taking a bit more history, she'd been abroad, and she happened to mention in the conversation that she'd eaten some raw meat while she was abroad. And so asking a few more questions, and was there anything unusual in the toilet? And it turned out there were some white specks when she was going to the toilet. What do you think I was suspecting at this point?
Scurvy?
I was suspecting a tapeworm. I'd just been on a course with WCPPE on anthelmintics and literally that week. And I thought, oh. And so she had some anthelmintic prescribed. I think it's a 1 dose, isn't it? And it seemed to sort it out, and health rapidly returned. The reason I like that story, and I think it's a good teaching story, is because I was a young pharmacist at the time, and she'd been through the system and no one had picked it up, because it was almost too simple a solution, I don't know, but no one had picked it up. And gave me an insight into the power that me as young community pharmacists on the high street could still make a real difference just by taking the time to listen and delve more deeply into people's problems. So I've never forgotten that one.
I think you should send that one into Pulse.
Thanks, Gimo. And so my one is a very simple one, but it was a real lesson very early on in my career, doing my clinical diploma in the hospital. Very excited about seeing gentamicin on drug charts, because you knew it was an opportunity to demonstrate your therapeutic drug monitoring expertise. And I was in the dispensary and realised I needed to do a gent calculation, and so I needed the patient's height. And so I thought, I'll rip down to the ward and I'll go and find his height. And that's what I did. And so I just went down. I can see it now, as Mark said, he can still see the same bed. I went down the corridor, went on to Ward 4, and just went straight up to the gentleman, didn't really think about anything, and just said, "I've come to measure you." And that was my delivery. They were my communication skills. And he had endocarditis, was quite unwell, and he just absolutely looked at me in a panic. And I just flushed then, realising, oh, that's gone badly. And he thought I'd come to measure him. And so it was a real moment for, just let loose, too quick, not thinking, not considered, very simple thing. All I wanted was to get his height and go back and work out the calculation and work out peaks and troughs and impress the team.
I actually think I've got a very similar one to that when I was doing the TPN round, the total parental nutrition, on the urology ward, where the fellas would always have a catheter in. So there was always stuff hanging about, if you know what I mean. And I went up there like you. I just went up there. And I don't even know to this day why I said it. And I just said, "I've come to have a look at your meat and 2 veg." Talking about his TPM bag. So there you go. We've all made mistakes.
Any more come to mind, Mark? We got time for one more from you.
It's not so much an individual story, but I guess it was the overriding stuff that Steve and I faced when we were at Wythenshawe, which I guess is the same on any inner city hospital, which goes back to the point I was making earlier about, that you can't tease out the physical from the psychological and the social. We've talked about the cases that we enjoyed, but as I say, they were once in a blue moon. But the stuff that we had to deal with on a daily basis, where you sort of see how the society that we've got actually leads to people having health that is completely suboptimal, which ultimately leads to lower life expectancies. As much as the good diagnoses used to give me that buzz and used to be the little treat that kept me going, the baseline was that my day-to-day emotion was just anger with the world for the way we had let these people get into this situation. And I also used to get angry with myself, because the acute medicine unit was a very, very busy place. And I always used to just feel that I could give more time to people. And I do remember there was one particular case of a chap who used to come into us regularly. He used to come in with an alcohol-related problem. It was a very difficult chap. And as soon as we dried him out a little bit, he would take his own discharge normally. But on this one occasion, I went to see him on the ward round when he'd been in for about 2 days. And when I went in to see him, I always used to introduce myself to the patients, as Steve knows. I'd always go up to them at the beginning. As I'd walk in the room, I'd say, "I'm sorry to disturb you. My name's Mark Holland." I didn't introduce myself as doctor. I say, "I'm Mark Holland. I'm the consultant who's looking after the ward today." And that was my standard patter. And I went up to this guy 2 days later and he just used my name. He said, "Mark, can I talk to you?" And I was shocked that this guy had remembered my name. And then we sat there and we started to talk, because it wasn't a busy post-take ward round. And this guy told me his life story. And I saw every time he came in, this person who was very thin, dishevelled. But his life story was that he'd once had a PhD. And for multiple reasons that we won't go into, because we don't want to breach confidentiality, his life had gone wrong. And his life had gone wrong with alcohol. And I came away from that experience thinking, you know, I have been such a twat. I'd never been rude to this guy. I'd never been unpleasant to this guy. But in the back of my mind, I don't think I'd respected him. And then suddenly I realised, you know, your life can just turn on a sixpence. And that really annoyed me. It annoyed me with the world. It annoyed me with myself. So I do think, yeah, in medicine, you do have those great moments. But if you actually believe in it, I'm the sort of person who is a bit competitive. I would often just feel that I think my baseline emotion at work was one of anger with how people's lives had ended up in this situation. I mean, the other thing that Steve and I used to talk about all the time was when young people were on SSRIs, and we'd say it's just so sad that, you know, when we were 18 or 19 we weren't on SSRIs, and this was 10 years ago that we were working together. But even now I'm speaking with loads of people, because we've all got teenage kids, and the angst and the difficulties that they're facing from all backgrounds now, social media, etc, etc. So yeah, if I can just go off on a slight tangent, when I was president of the Society for Acute Medicine, I got asked to go to a round table at the Royal College of Physicians in London, and we were all having an audience with Simon Stevens, and lots of ologies were there, and all of the ologies were coming out with the same patter. Medicine's difficult. We all need more resources. We all need more consultants. We all need more of this, more of that. And my turn came, and I said to him, look, I didn't call him Simon, you know, probably Mr. Stevens, but I said, look, Si, here's the deal. Give me £1 billion. Give me £1 billion tomorrow. I work in acute medicine. I do lots of work as well, linking in with the emergency department, all of that sort of stuff that you're under pressure for. Do you know how much I would spend on my service? I wouldn't spend 1 penny. I wouldn't spend 1 penny on acute medicine. I wouldn't spend 1 penny on emergency care. I'd spend £1 billion on getting social care right. I'd spend all of that money properly training care workers to go into people's homes and give the support to the older patients so that we can get them out of hospital. If you get the patients out of the back of the hospital, if you look after them properly outside of hospital, you'll get everyone out and you'll get the flow going at the front of the hospital. And I still believe in that. If I was in charge of health and budgetary, I would shift so much resource into social care and mental health care as well, for that matter.
Dear listener, that is exactly what Mark would have said. I have absolutely no doubt that that's exactly what he said to the guy who was the big cheese. And I go back to my original phrase at the beginning. I didn't know we were going to get into this. We need to look for the needy, not the noisy.
Very good. Well, it took 35 minutes or so to get Mark down to our level, but he finally used the word twat. Brilliant, Mark. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you. So a big thank you to Mark for joining us on the Oral Apothecary and for sharing his Desert Island Drug, his career anthem and his book. Well, that's it for our second series. Thanks to all of you for downloading, listening and recommending the Oral Apothecary. Wherever you are in the world, your support is really appreciated. And just to be very clear, we know that it's our guests, their stories and their experiences that you love listening to. So a huge thank you to all of our guests for Series 1 and Series 2. They take time out of busy and hectic lives to record with us. They're often quite nervous, and so we'll be looking to improve our green room experience for Series 3. We'll be back refreshed and ready to go with more superb guests and their stories at the beginning of September. And remember, great stories happen to people that tell them. Until then, we hope you have a great summer. You can contact us via email on oralapothecarypod@gmail.com and follow us on Twitter at Oral Apothecary. Over to Gimmo now for the final ingredient.
Thank you from me to Mark and to everyone who's listened, and also thanks to everyone who did vote for us in the British Podcast Awards. I don't think we've been shortlisted, but we're up against some big guns there, but anything that gets the name out there. We had a comment on Spreaker, which is the website that we host this on, from Dr. Alan Shaughnessy. He's a pharmacist, isn't he, Jamie, I think, who's the colleague of Professor Dave Slawson, who we had on last week. They were originally due to come on as a pair and they couldn't, but we'll be getting him on for series 3 hopefully. He loved the idea that as much effort needs to be devoted to learning how to talk to people as is spent on learning about medicines, and he also loves the idea of wicked problems. It was a new idea for him. Thanks for that, Alan, and look forward to seeing you next series or season, because he is American. So the final ingredient